All right, guys, we're going to deal with a man by the name of Soren Kierkegaard. Famous individual, but probably not highly popular today, but very influential. Here's a quote to start off. People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought, which they seldom use. That's a fascinating quote, right? So people want freedom or freedom of speech, but they're not exercising like freedom of thought. They're not using their minds before they speak, but they want the freedom to speak. That's interesting to me. But Kierkegaard is influential because of his philosophical contributions, namely existentialism. He was a Christian existentialist. Now, this philosophy, you may not be familiar with it, and we don't have time to go into great lengths on it, but it's the idea that there is something beyond just the reason or rational. There's a subjectivity to life. So modern day existentialists are largely atheistic and agnostic. So many people would see Kierkegaard's contribution here perhaps negatively, as it didn't lead to a stronger view of Christianity and faith, but maybe one that was antithetical to the faith. Of course, Kierkegaard himself was not, and so one could argue that true existentialism would have to be Christian, and that those who later took existentialism apart from Christ really missed its main point. So there's two ways you could ultimately see this. But Kierkegaard, as a young man, he studied to be a Lutheran pastor. So he's born in Germany, he's raised in a Lutheran context, and he ends up spends 10 years in school. His dad was quite wealthy. He took his time to do a lot of study, reading, writing. So he didn't actually have to make a lot of money. So he didn't have to finish quick and become a priest. He really wanted to be a philosopher, and he was, and ended up being a philosopher. And he was very critical of the church of his day. Now, he makes a decision that he looks back and probably realizes he messed up in, and that he loved a woman, he was going to get married, but he calls off the marriage because he believes to truly be free in life, to be a philosopher, to really go through life as it was intended, you must be unhindered and unencumbered with burdens and duties and things of that nature. And so he calls off this wedding, which I think for the rest of his life he regrets. And kind of sees that man isn't just an objective, rational being. So he can rationally think, I want to be free, but there's a subjectivity that marriage brings. Even though it, marriage has certain duties that you have to fulfill, there's a certain happiness that is in those duties that one doesn't realize when they're young. And so for Kierkegaard, this is where he feels Hegel and the popular philosophers of his day are sheer rationalists, that God is to be understood as a system of rationality versus this unsearchable and unknowable being. And he's very critical of kind of the Christendom, that because you have a Christian society and everyone is Christian, that somehow that's a better thing. In fact, he sees it as a pagan thing, because he says no one truly believes. No one truly has the faith of Christianity of the early church. There's just a cultural Christianity that ultimately is not Christianity at all. There is no true faith. There is no true life. And so I think for Kierkegaard, more so than a person that we should follow word for word, I think he's a good critic of what is going on in his day. He says this: God creates out of nothing. Wonderful, you say. Yes, to be sure. But he does what is still more wonderful. He makes saints out of sinners. So again, for Kierkegaard, I think a quote in that shows his desire to see holiness, to see godliness, and he doesn't see it in his day. He later says this: during the first period of a man's life, the greatest danger is not to take risk. So I think that has a lot to do with his marriage, not getting married, but also in the risk of following Christ. And he's known for the famous statement, leap of faith. Many people see that as a negative connotation because they'll say that's irrationality. Faith is irrational. But for him, he pictures that as a person who's on a cliff and there's a raging fire and he hears a voice at the bottom that he can't see in the pitch dark say, jump. So there's faith to jump in that which you don't see, yet you hear the voice. So it's not completely irrational. It's just that he's trying to say there's not a full grasp. You can't have a full grasping of something before you come to faith. Another quote by him, he says, if I am capable of grasping God objectively, I do not believe, but precisely because I cannot do this, I must believe. So it's kind of like, if I don't believe in gravity, it just is. It's just something that I go about accepting. And so for God, he's like, God isn't just something we accept and move on. It's not just a pure objective thing. Because I cannot fully grasp it and comprehend him, that's why I must exercise faith. So a different way of thinking about God or coming to God than I think is that we might think about it. And the reason I bring him up as influential is because to this day, there's a very subjectivity to the world. And this is largely existentialist thought. Much of it is bad, but there's a truth in it. And I think that the person is more than mere ration, more than mere thought. There's an emotional aspect to humanity, and there's subjective things that weigh on our conscience, weigh on our being. Someone's death, someone's life, the way someone speaks to us. Those things are often more impactful than a rational argument to us. And he one last quote here. He says, "It is hard to believe because it is so hard to obey." So I think in Kierkegaard we see this first this notion of sometimes people will disbelieve because they can't obey. They can't live out the faith. So rather than say, well, the faith is true, but my life is wrong, they give up the faith and say, well, it's hard to believe because it's hard to obey. People don't want to live in contradiction. And so they give up their belief rather than change their action, because it's easier to change one's belief than it is one's action. I'll close with this story by Kierkegaard I've always found fascinating. He sees the German society and Christendom as this. There's a preacher that goes, and it's a duck church, and all the ducks are saying, ducks, we are birds like eagles, we have wings like eagles, we can soar, we could fly. And he hypes everyone up on this notion that ducks are just like other birds, are just like eagles, and they have the same strength and the same power, and yet they all say amen, and the ducks all waddle home. So there's no true change, there's no true application of the gospel. There's just a listening and a walking in the same thing. And so for Kierkegaard, he wanted to see a true faith that was vibrant, and he didn't see that in the state church and the Christendom that's just cultural. So he felt that Christianity must be true and vibrant, and there must be this internal struggle that takes place that we must first come to before we can embrace it and live it out. We'll see you guys Monday. Have a blessed day.